Hi everybody, welcome to my video today, which is my question of the week video. This is a question that I get very often from families, and they want to know what's going on and why do kids stop talking. My name is Marcy Melzer, and I am an intuitive speech and language pathologist, and I help parents teach their late talking children how to use the words they need to share their wisdom with the world. And today I'm going to talk to you about why kids stop talking. It's, like I said, a very common question that I get from parents all over the world. And the short answer to that question is because the speech and language system, as kids learn it, breaks down at some point in their early development, and what happens is kids shift over to using an alternative system. So that's why they stop talking, because their talking system starts to get going, and then it breaks down. So what I'm going to tell you about on this video, and I've got some nice graphics for you, is I'm going to show you that communication system in a real basic form that parents can understand, so that you can see what happens in the communication system that causes blockages, that causes kids to stop in their natural communication progression as they learn to use speech. And then I'm going to show you what happens to cause them to stop even moving forward in the same system. And I've got a couple graphics to show you about that first. So, okay, here we go. So the first thing I'm going to show you is this is the speech and language learning system in a real basic form. And it starts over here, first with the child hearing people speaking words. So what happens first is the child learns, he listens to people speaking, and then the child listens for repetition. So do they hear that same word over and over again? So in order to know that a word is a word, a child has to hear it over and over again. And then the next thing that happens is the child assigns that word to an experience. So let's say we're talking about the word hug, right? Child hears people saying the word hug. He hears them over and over again saying hug when they ask him for a hug or they give him a hug. So the child assigns that word hug in their head. They learn and they understand that the word hug is what people say when you get a hug or you give a hug, or that thing that they think is a hug. And then the child practices the word. So they may say the word hug when they hug you again. And then what happens then is that it's confirmed by another human speaker. So they get the word hug, they practice it, they say it, and then someone else says hug because they ask someone else for a hug and they prove that it works and that person gave them a hug. So it's confirmed and they're like, yep, that's how I learned that word. So in order to progress with all speech and language and all using words, you have to follow this very basic program. There's many more steps that go in the whole process, but this is some of the basic processes that have to happen. I'm going to go through one more time. First, the child hears people saying words. Then the child listens for repetition. Then they assign that word to an experience that they have, or a thing that they see, or something that they hold or touch or do. And then the child practices that word later, and then it's confirmed by another human speaker. So when the child uses it and tries the word on their own, because first they have to learn it and then they try it, and then another speaker, a human, tells them, yeah, that's the right word. And usually it's by complying with the direction or indicating what it is. So those are the steps, sort of the series to go through in regular speech, typical speech learning. That's the series of things that kids have to go through. So this next graphic I have, what I've done is I have those same steps up here starting to move across. So I have the first steps of what kids have to do, and then what I have here in the red boxes are what could cause there to be a breakdown at that particular level in the communication system, the language learning system. So this is verbal speech and language learning, okay? All language learns, with that kind of thing. But if we're talking about talking here, that's where you have to have speech involved. So the first thing, right, child hears people speaking words is the first step. Now, what can go wrong? Here's just a few examples of what can go wrong at this stage. So, any kind of hearing loss obviously is going to stop a child from being able to hear words. Any kind of ear fluid that a child has, I'm trying to get my, there you go. Any kind of ear fluid is going to cause muffled hearing and what I call a poor signal. So they're not getting very good, they're not hearing the words as they should be said, is kind of what the deal is there. And then the other thing that can cause problems at this stage is limited exposure. Okay, so if a child isn't hearing adults speaking words, then they're not going to, because adults aren't speaking words around them, or they're not hearing words spoken by human people. If they're hearing words that are only spoken by technology, TV, audio, video, that kind of thing, that's also going to, yeah, they will learn language from that, but if we're talking about speech, your child has to hear people saying that word. It's just, it's a necessary part. So at the beginning stage, obviously, if we're talking about hearing, then hearing is going to be, I'm trying to figure out how to get this straight. So hearing is going to be affected by these things. And then the next step right here, where the child is listening for repetition. So problems that can happen at this stage of the game are going to be over here with reduced attention. So if there's a problem with attention, a child isn't going to listen to words over and over again, okay? And then if there is limited exposure, that just kind of like that happened over here, that also can be a cause for a child to not hear words over and over again. So that limited exposure is going to be a block to this stage in the learning system. Or another thing that could block this listening for repetition is overexposure. So a lot of times parents will, you know, if a child is late talking and they're, you know, starting to learn, or a parent is talking a lot in long, long phrases that a child can't like pick out a word in edgewise, especially if they're having difficulty with attending, or even if they, because what happens is if they don't have the first step, it's difficult to move on. So even a child who has had hearing issues like middle ear fluid or limited exposure, see how you see it again over here, they're not going to hear repetition either. So you have to hear the word the first time, you have to hear it clearly, and you have to hear it repeatedly over and over and over again so that you can get it into your memory banks. And so overexposure is going to limit a child's ability to understand all of the words that are coming at them. So when, you know, you're speaking very simply to a child as they first start learning language, if there's too much language exposure, or maybe there are many, many people in a child's environment and all of these people are talking to them and they don't know who to pay attention to. There's not any real specific directed communication towards the child. So next step in the learning system is that the child assigns words to their experience. So what can break down at that stage of the game is that they have they can have few repetitive experiences with language and people. Okay, so I'm going to explain that. So in order for your child to learn that a word means something, they have to have over and over experiences hearing a person say that word along with their experience. Now, a lot of kids who are learning language and understanding language because they watch it on technology, obviously they're not hearing a person, a real live person, but they may be watching people talking, and that's how they learn that way. So, but then they have to assign that word to their experiences. So they have to know the right word at the right time. So when you're giving a hug is when, you know, they learn that that's the word for hug because you're giving a hug right then. Okay, so now another thing that can cause a child to have difficulty is if they have few repetitive experiences with language. So they're not hearing things over and over again, maybe because they're not paying attention, or maybe because they're not getting exposure again to those things over and over again, or the signal is poor and they have this ear fluid issue that maybe is causing them to not be able to hear that it is the right word. They don't hear it consistently time to time again, maybe if ear issues are different. So there's lots of things that can cause. They have to have that they have to have a good signal. So a poor signal that's going to cause this problem. And then here's the other one. that is a big blockage to sort of this stage in the language learning system is testing before teaching. And get that in, so there you go, testing before teaching, right there. That's a big thing that can actually block kids in the middle of their language learning thing. So it's like learning anything. If you are tested before you have full grip on the knowledge, it's going to cause you to be anxious about learning or about doing that thing. So you're not going to be sure if you're correct. You're not going to be sure if you know what's going on. And a lot of parents, what they do is they start to elicit language in children who aren't talking, maybe because of one of the first two things. But what happens is then the parents often start asking a lot of questions. What are you doing? What do you have? What is that? Where are you putting it? You know, that kind of thing. And to elicit a child to give them some sort of an answer to their question as a way to elicit them to come out with the words that you know they understand, that they've been exposed to before, they've seen on technology, they've heard you talk or whatever. But when you test a child before they know the issue, that's going to turn them away from doing this activity. So it's really important with language that you teach before you test. But this is a thing, a real thing, that causes a lot of families to have breakdown in the speech and language learning system. Okay? So here's the next step in the learning system, that the child practices words. Okay? So they have to practice words in order to get them and learn them as speech. And so here's some things that can block a child at this stage of the language learning system. So the first one, I'm going to get them zoomed in here, is right here, is no vocal play. So that is a child who's not playing with speech and language. Kids who don't babble, sorry, this isn't focusing very well. So they aren't babbling, they aren't playing with noises, you know, they're a quiet personality, or they maybe didn't hear things, like I said. But that is one of the things that's going to stop them from practicing. If they're not playing with language, that's what comes first. That babbling stuff usually comes first before kids start to say words, and then the first words they say are hard to understand, and then they get better as a child practices more with talking. So very often the first things that kids talk, that baby talk, can be repetitive things and stuff like that. So right here, the things that can block this practice are no vocal play, but they also maybe have few speech models to imitate, okay? So maybe they don't have a lot of parents talking to them, or they're learning a lot of language that's coming from technology, where the technology is talking to them and no one is giving them the opportunity to imitate. Because kids have to imitate. That's a really good way that we learn language, is we hear somebody else say something and then we imitate what we hear. So if kids aren't giving models, there's no speech models, it kind of goes back to that limited exposure thing. And then the other thing that can really cause a child to have difficulty practicing words is if their throat and mouth don't work correctly. If there is a tongue tie, if there is a cleft palate, if there is throat issues, or even illness, like if there's you know, chronic ear, nose, and throat problems, drainage, coughing, things like that, that can also cause difficulty for a child to practice words if their throat and mouth are not working correctly. Trying to get that to focus again. And then, okay, I'm going to move on here and look at the last one over here, is that the last stage in the speech and language learning system that can break down is that communication has to be confirmed by another human speaker. Okay, I'm going to try to get this close and get it there for you. And so what can break that down is, again, limited exposure to other humans. So if a child is learning a lot of their language on technology, that's going to be an issue where they're, you know, learning their limited exposure to language. And then here's the other thing that can break that down. I'm trying to get it focused. There we go. No idea exchange. Okay. Now, what does that mean? No idea exchange. So in order for something to be confirmed by someone else, you have to be communicating the same idea. If your child is wanting a cookie and they bring you a cookie, that's a pretty obvious idea that they want it, they're bringing it to you to give them, and that idea is communicated. You understand it because of their behavior or whatever they're communicating. In order for a child to use words and learn to make words work, they have to say the word and practice it, and then another human has to agree, yeah, that's right, that's what and the way that gets confirmed is that they get the request that they want, or that other human being recasts or says the words back to them with some kind of a, yeah, you said ball, to get the ball, things like that. So that's how you have to have that kind of, you must, in order to integrate the language for you to be able to use it again, it has to be reconfirmed by another human speaker. And like I said, what can break that down is limited exposure and no idea exchange. And no idea exchange happens when parents are trying to get kids to talk or tell them things and the child's not paying attention. They don't care. They're on their own thing. If a parent's trying to get a child to do something or say a word and the child is already non-verbally communicating something to you, they're focused on their own communication system. They're not going to be sharing the same idea, like, I'd like for you to say this word for you to get what you want, even though that's what you're saying out loud. Is if you say cookie, you can have cookie. Just because you're saying that out loud doesn't mean that your child understands what that exchange means, okay? So in order for a child to really learn words themselves, they have to practice it and say it out loud and then have it be confirmed by another human being. So that's the system, and those are the things that can break down. All right, so moving forward, now I'm going to tell you what happens, because again, we're talking about on this video, why do kids stop talking? So we talked about what's going to cause a blockage at any one of those things. And then of course, yeah, talking's more difficult, but why do kids stop talking? Well, they stop talking because they use a new system. They replace the speech and language learning with a new communication system that doesn't involve speech and language, because they're not using the speech and language. So what I've done here on this graphic is show you in the speech and language system how kids replace those systems, those steps, with how they replace speech and language with other things and what happens to cause that to happen, what kids do. So it starts with, over here, the child hears people speaking words. So if there is a breakdown, like I talked about on this other graphic, there's a problem with hearing or problem with something like that, then the child needs to rely on their visual and physical input to learn what kind of things are being communicated. So if hearing is difficult and they can't hear, or hearing is not as effective for them, sorry about the sunshine on here, then the child relies on visual and physical input from you. And the child learns to see behavior as primary communication. Because the words they don't hear well, they can't understand them, they can't see, they can't hear what's going on, because their hearing is affected somehow, or they aren't exposed to language in the first place. And so it becomes less and less meaningful for them. And when things are less meaningful, then we're not going to pay attention to them, and we're going to look and use our other systems. So if your ears aren't working well, what are we going to do? We're going to use our eyes more and look more. So what happens is, instead of your child becoming a listener and listening to you talk to them, that signal isn't good. It's not valid for them. They don't understand it. It doesn't make sense. It's mushy if they have ear fluid for whatever reason. And then what happens is, as they need to communicate with you, they start to watch. And if your child's not responding to you talking to them, what are you going to do? If you say, give me your hand, and your child doesn't reach up their hand, you're going to reach down and take their hand. If your child is, you're trying to keep your child out from running in the street, and they're not going to listen to you say, stop, don't run in the street, you're going to physically restrain them and keep them back from running in the street. And it happens with everything. Kids, you say, come here, your child's not listening to you or doesn't understand or process that language, you're going to take their hand and bring them along with you. If you want them to come along, if you want to show them something, if you want them to do whatever, you're going to physically help them do that thing because you need it done. It's time to go. It's time to go potty. It's time to go in the bathtub. You have to do that. So that's what you do, is you physically help your child learn all those things. So this is what your child does. They learn at the very first step. They give up listening to words as a real way to learn language and communication, and they start to rely on visual and physical input. And so then they start to see behavior as the primary communication, not speech and language. Because speech and language is hard. They don't understand it. They don't know what it is. So they start to look at it as behavior. Now, the next step in the phase is that the child listens for repetition. So if they're understanding that behavior is their communication, what are they doing? They're watching for repetitive behaviors that have meaning. Okay, so, and that's what I was talking about. If you're taking your child's hand and bringing them places, or if you're physically kind of getting behind them and guiding them to come along with you, instead of using words, come with me, then your child is watching what you do over and over and over again to communicate with them. And instead of listening to your words to communicate, they're watching and feeling your behaviors. So they learn, okay, now I know how to communicate. This is how mom and dad are communicating with me. Now this is the way that I learn to communicate. So instead of moving forward, in this case, like assigning a word to the experience that they're doing, like hug, they're going to assign behaviors to experience. So instead of using a word to ask you for a hug, they're just going to come up and hug you. And just because they know that that's what they want, they know that's the behavior that goes, and they know that when you hug them, it feels good. And so they learn, I want that behavior again. So they're just going to go and get it. They're just going to go and do that behavior on their own. And they're going to assign the behaviors to their experiences. Now, this is what happens with nonverbal communication like sign language, okay? So let's say a child really wants something, and one time they waved their hand in front of it, and you understood what they wanted and you gave it to them. Just because they waved their hand in that direction and that worked. That taught your child, hey, when I do this with my hand, my parents are going to respond. And so that helped your child assign that hand wave, or you know, let's say it's a pinch to get your attention. Your child's going to pinch you. You're going to go, ow, and you're going to stop and you're going to give them attention. They're going to go, oh, that worked. So the next time they do it, they're going to pinch again, and they're going to learn that pinching or poking or hugging or dragging or bringing you the object, they're going to assign those behaviors, okay? So, and actually, I've already moved into the next one, because they're going to assign the things that you do to the experiences that they have. And then instead of practicing words, they're going to imitate the behavior that they see, okay? And then what they're going to do, because if you don't do all the behaviors for all the things that they want to communicate, then they're going to invent their own, like the hand wave, like the pinch. They're going to scream, they're going to tantrum, they're going to do whatever they need to do to get their message across, because they don't have words and they're watching you do your behavior and they're imitating what you do. But if you don't do that behavior or they don't see it, then what they're going to do is come up with things on their own, okay? Now, if a child is talking, if they're using speech, they're going to imitate the speech that they hear. If they're learning behavior for communication, then they're going to imitate the behavior that they see and that you use with them to communicate, okay? And then what happens then is, obviously at the end, it's confirmed by a human speaker, and what happens is then the child is going to, now a human speaker is going to respond to what they're doing to communicate in one way or another, and then the child is going to respond now to any kind of speech that they get. They're going to respond physically. Okay, I'm trying to find this to get it to, there we go. So the child is going to respond physically to speech. So you're going to be talking to them in response to their behavior, but their response for you is going to be physical, because once again, they have shifted from a verbal speech and language communication system into a nonverbal behavior-based communication system. Okay, so that's what happens, and that's why kids stop talking. They may get started, they may get to one of those points along that communications learning system, speech and language learning system that every child goes through naturally, okay? But if something happens along the way, they're going to shift away from the speech and language learning into using a nonverbal or behavior-based physical behavior system. All right, so now the last thing I'm going to tell you as we get going, this is going to get a long video, but I've got all these graphics for you. So the next thing we're going to talk about is what can you do to switch back to speech, because your child has switched over and your family has switched over to these nonverbal communication systems. So what I've done now is I've given you 5 bullet points to teach you what to do to help your child move back out of these nonverbal communication systems back into speech, okay? So the first thing you need to do is you need to identify the cause of the breakdown in the system. So it comes back to this other graphic I had here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link to this graphic, or I'll put a PDF or something like that. So it comes back to that graphic where I talked about the blockages. And you need to find out what it is that is causing your child to have a breakdown at the levels of the system that they are. So that's the first thing you have to do, is identify the cause of the breakdown in the system. Now, a lot of parents will, when I ask them, why do you think your child's not talking? They may say something like, my child has autism. But that's not enough digging, okay? Autism doesn't tell us anything. Autism is a spectrum disorder. Some kids have autism and they're completely nonverbal and they'll never be verbal. But some kids have autism diagnoses and they are verbal and they are talking and they are making a lot of improvement with natural verbal language, even though they have an autism diagnosis. So the autism diagnosis alone is not enough information for you. You need to come back to the root causes for the breakdown at each stage of the communication system. So that's what has to happen first. And then you have to address the source of your child's frustration and resistance. So if your child is not using language, if they have shifted over to moving something nonverbal, then something about speech and language makes them frustrated. And you need to find out what's causing that frustration and resistance. And in many cases, it's what I talked about with that testing before teaching, prompting kids, or expecting them to try to do things that are what they think is too hard, okay? So the next step, and that's why I said you have to understand how, let me fix this up, there you go. You have to understand how the modified system, the new physical behavior system, you have to understand how that is right now. What behaviors is your child using? What are they using to communicate with you if they're not using words? You have to know, because you have to identify the current communication behaviors, because if you think that your child's just being naughty because they pinch you every time they're trying to get your attention, it's not necessarily correct. They're not being naughty, they're just trying to communicate with you. They don't know the difference. They came up with that on their own. So what you need to do is you need to identify what all of those things are, okay? Now, the next thing that we have to do in order to get kids to switch back to speech is, let me get this one straight, there we go. You have to facilitate language skills to replace those current communication behaviors, okay? So, if your child is using, hi Brianna, if your child is using communication behaviors, you need to identify what those are, and then you have to replace each one of those communication behaviors with words. And you have to show your child exactly how to do that. use the right words at the right time whenever they're using that behaviors. You have to shift it into using words, okay? And then the next thing you have to do is you must, in order to get kids to shift out of, because we're talking about a shift from a communication system, all right? I've always been communicating with this behavior. This is what, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, all late talkers. If they're using a nonverbal communication system, they're set in it, and so is your family. You've got to wait, you're stuck where you are, unless you have to make some change. So in order to make change, okay, you have to do this. You have to have fun with language during your everyday activities. You must have fun with it, because if you are encouraging your child to change, it has to be easy. It has to be fun. You have to make it a process that they want to be involved in. And that's why overcoming that frustration that I talked about is so, so important, because if your child is frustrated with you trying to get them to talk, you're never going to move past that current system, because the current system is working better than speech. And you have to show your child how speech is easy, happy, safe, and fun, because if it isn't fun, it isn't fun. And then what you have to do is you have to train your child to use speech. That's number 5. You have to train your child to use speech for social communication. You have to train your child to use speech for social communication, okay? So I'm going to hold these up here right now. What that means is that you have to show your child that instead of behaviors to communicate with other people, not just you and your family, that words are the way for them to communicate with everybody who speaks the same language anyway. So if you speak English and you live in the United States and everyone around you is speaking English, your child needs to be able to speak English to communicate with most of the people in your community. And if you're using language and your child is using nonverbal communication to communicate instead, they've stopped talking, they're using nonverbal communication instead, then they're going to have to shift over, and you're going to have to show them not only how to communicate with you, but you as a parent are going to have to show them how to communicate with siblings, with all the people in your family, with neighbors, friends, kids at school, things like that. You're going to have to help them facilitate communication that way. Okay, so I'm going to hold these up one more time to tell you, because the thing is, here's the thing. Of all the children, 1 in 10 children is late talking for some reason or another, okay? And that's a lot of kids. So if your child is late talking, you need to understand that 70 to 80% of all late talkers can make this switch back, okay? If your child was talking and they stopped talking and now they're talking, you want to get them talking again, you can do it if you follow these 5 steps, okay? Because this is what the families are doing in my Waves of Communication program. This is literally it. This is what they're doing. And this is what I help them do. I help them go through this whole process so that they get their kids switched back to speech. And here they are one more time. Here's what you have to do. First, you have to identify the cause of the breakdown in the system. Then you have to address the source or sources of frustration and resistance. You must address them first, otherwise you're just stuck in frustration and resistance. You have to address it and overcome those things. And that's the other thing that I help families do in my Waves of Communication program, is understand what that resistance is, what's causing it, and how to change that behavior, okay? The next thing you do is you need to understand how the modified system, the nonverbal system, your child, you have to understand how it is working right now. And then you have to facilitate the language skills to replace those current communication behaviors. So if your child's not using words, they're using something else to communicate, and your job is going to be facilitating language. And in order to do that, you must have fun with language during your everyday activities. So all the times that your child is using nonverbal communication with you, you have to be language facilitating and teaching them how to use language that way. And that's what I show parents how to do, is literally do language facilitation while you are, with your kids in the tub. And then the next thing is you have to train your child to use speech for social communication, okay? Now, If you want to know more about how to work with me, you should go to my wavesofcommunication.com website and click on the free class. And once you go through that free class, you will learn how the Waves of Communication works to go through this whole process and teach families how it works, and that's how it goes. And I have 30 families in the program, and every single family in the program has their lay talkers starting to use new words and word approximations within 3 to 6 weeks. So it can be done. It most definitely can be done. It doesn't matter about diagnosis, but your child has to have good ears. They have to have, they have to be able to hear speech, and you have a good ear, nose, and throat system. So you have to get them healthy enough to hear and talk. And then once you have that system in place, then you can start from square one or square A, point A, wherever your child is right now, to get them using language. So that's what I wanted to share with you today on this video. Like I said, one of the most common questions I have is, why do kids stop talking? And the short answer is, it's because the communication system breaks and kids shift away from it. They just start moving into using nonverbal and behavioral communication, and then what happens is they get stuck in that nonverbal communication. And what I do is I help parents get your kiddos unstuck and your family unstuck from those nonverbal communication, get rid of that frustration, that lack of communication frustration, and teach your children how to use the words they need to share all of their wisdom with the world. And I do that in my Waves of Communication program. So go ahead and check out my website. And until next time, I will see you on my next live video that I'll be talking more about language facilitation and tips for parents. Until then, everybody have a great day, and I'll see you on my next live video.